Have you ever wondered if we're just living in an illusion controlled by an immense power that leads to endless conflict, impossible commitments, and aching desires? Well, that's exactly what KULT Divinity Lost explores. In this video, I'm going to be doing an overall review of the system and who I think this RPG is the best fit for. The first edition of KULT was published in the 1990s in Sweden, and most recently, Helmgast have published the 4th edition rules called KULT Divinity Lost, which uses the Powered by the Apocalypse system. Now, I absolutely need to get a content warning out of the way. This RPG is for mature audiences. It focuses on personal horror, meaning traumatic experiences, other common trigger subjects like sexual content, abuse, suicide, religion, and other heavy topics that some people might not enjoy playing or enjoy listening about. So be aware of that before you dive in the system, and be mindful before you invite people to play this game as well. There is a section in the book called the Horror Contract and talks about the safety side, which is really important in this game, but also the flip side of things. So what are the scary things that you would find fun to have in the game and explore? So what this means is that if everyone's game and comfortable and excited to play, you can really push the boundaries on horror that you might not feel like you can in other games. And I personally experienced this with this system. There were games that I played that really stuck with me. Like, I remember there was one session that we had done, and afterwards I felt adrenaline, literal adrenaline through my body, and I needed to go walk outside in the cold for a little bit to actually bring my nervous system down. And that is not normal for me or a normal occurrence when I'm playing horror RPGs. So really it was pushing the boundaries on what we can play and having that experience. And I found it really fun for me personally. Now again, this might not be everyone's jam, so just keep that in mind that it can be a little bit heavy and push those boundaries. Let's start with the lore of KULT, which I absolutely loved and found really intriguing and interesting. This takes place in the present day, and essentially at the heart of the KULT mythos is the concept of the Demiurge, a powerful and malevolent entity that created the 10 Archons. These 10 Archons are godlike entities that control different principles like community, honor, and submission. The Demiurge and Archons created Elysium, which is a reflection of what we think is our world, but really it is a prison and a false reality, and we are all just living in the illusion. See, every human is divine. Reality is just a prison made by the Demiurge to make us forget that. Jailers keep us trapped as the Demiurge feeds on our souls, an infinite machine of spiritual energy, feeding his power and keeping him in existence. Where the players come in is they're slowly awakening to this truth and reality, and it's shattering for them, and they have to experience the different horrors as they start to see through this illusion. For me, what sets KULT apart is its deep dive into the human psyche. The concept of the Demiurge who enjoys feeding and tormenting on these souls and driven by control and fear is an interesting antagonist that kind of sets this apart, a different realm of horror. The constant pull against the illusion and that yearning for truth is an interesting dynamic, and I really enjoyed playing that out over several sessions. And that leads me to the rulebook. So I want to start first by talking about the art and layout in this book, which, oh my gosh, it blew me away. Look how gorgeous this art is. The layout is even crooked in some places, making you feel like you might be a little bit crazy even as you're reading the rulebook. Okay, this book is beautiful, but what about the usability for gameplay? The book is broken out to 3 sections, one for players, one for GMs, and one for general lore. First is the player section, which was laid out well. It was pretty simple to get the base understanding of the rules and their characters created, everything they really would need to go to get up and running. Flipping to the lore section, I had no issues here as well. It's pretty chunky, it takes up a lot of the book, so if you're really into reading different lore, you might enjoy this part of the rulebook. Now I want to focus on the middle section, which is for game masters, and I struggled a bit here. Here's where I really felt like the rulebook needed a bit more organization and clarity. I had to read it multiple times to really understand and get the rules, and there were critical rules and information that were sometimes scattered throughout the rulebook, making it challenging for players to quickly find what they need during a game session. Combat in particular was really tough to grasp because there wasn't a dedicated section for it, and stability as well was kind of of buried in the player section, and that's something that I wish had a separate section also, just to really explain it and make it clear and have a good reference for when you're actually playing the game. So although the player side and the lore piece of the rulebook were organized well enough to get the information, the GM side was a bit of a struggle to slug through, and you might have to read it a few times to really get the rules. Moving on to character creation. This is the best character creation I have ever experienced, and I have played a lot of RPGs. It was an absolute joy to create characters and watch as other people created their characters and watch the relationships between different players unfold in front of me and develop and ask questions to be able to go further into their backstory. This is such a strong element of KULT. With that in mind, I always recommend you have a session 0 to make these characters so everyone's at the table at the same time and you can play off of each other and create relationships. Now, if this is a shorter scenario, you might have a session 0 that happens just right before you start playing, not a dedicated session. But if it's for a longer campaign, I would recommend a dedicated session where you're creating characters, asking questions, and getting deeper into their backstory so that you as the GM can have levers to pull and personal relationships that you can work into your campaign. This is also an important time to note that for any of the scenarios that are free from Helmgas, which they have quite a few available for you, I recommend you use the pre-generated characters because there's a lot of connections within the scenario that relate directly to those characters, and it's going to make your life a lot easier and probably the experience for the players a lot more fun if you just use the pre-generated characters for those pre-written scenarios. So for character creation, you have 4 options. You're either sleeper, aware, enlightened, or awakened. Most people will start as aware, in which you are kind of starting to wake up to this illusion, and there are 20 different archetypes. Yes, I said 20. Now that seems like a lot, and I loved having that different variety. You'll have things like dark secrets, disadvantages, and advantages, where you have a list to pick from, and it didn't take too long to kind of sift through that and decide what you wanted to lean into for your character. Next, you have different attributes, and I loved the ease here. There was still choice, but it was so simple. You just had to assign pluses and minuses to different attributes, and it was quick and easy, but enough choice that it was satisfying for the players. And what makes this character creation really unique is the relations portion. So you would have relations with people at the table, but also potential NPCs, which gives plus or minuses to different roles associated with those people. So those are important triggers to have for the GM, and also ways that stability might be increased or decreased is if these relations are affected. Moving on to gear, there's no money system. It's kind of just determined by the GM and player, so it's what you would reasonably have. There's not a ton of options for the gear, so it left me as a GM having to sometimes wiggle my way into certain categories to figure out how much harm they would do. It wasn't a big deal, but just something to note that it's not quite as detailed as you might be used to seeing in other systems. Moving on to the general mechanics of the game. So players have moves, which is all listed on their sheet, plus the option to help or hinder. What you do to make a move is roll 2d10 plus a related attribute and modifiers. Then you check the chart for a level of success. In general, I didn't have much issue with the core mechanics, but it did take a little bit of getting used to that I had to reference a chart every time that a roll was made, just to know the specifics on the different types of moves. So although the thresholds for success, partial success, and failure were all the same, those specifics were different based on the move, and I didn't have those memorized, so it was pretty clunky the first few sessions that I played it. A few moves I want to call out in particular: read a person, observe a situation, and investigate. On a success, players get to ask the GM 2 questions. On a partial, 1 question. And it's from a very limited list of questions. And I felt like the questions kind of put a lot on the GM to reveal enough and be truthful without giving away too much information. It was a fine balance that took me a little bit of practice to really get used to. For example, what is being hidden from me? That's a very vague general question, and it can be a little bit difficult to apply an appropriate answer in the moment when your players want a reward for successfully making a player move. Also, the list of questions were a little bit limited, so I did home rule that you can have flexibility with those questions and ask what you would want within reason. Like if you're doing a murder mystery, you can't ask who did the murder, but There's some limits and reasonableness that goes both ways from the player side and the GM side to give a little bit of flexibility to the number of questions that they might ask for these player moves. And sometimes a failure would lead to the GM being able to make a move. And so that leads into what GM moves are, which is either a soft or hard move. A soft move is essentially that the players can have a chance to avoid the consequences, whereas a hard move, it just happens. And this was a learning curve for me because I didn't always know when to make a specific move versus just describing and letting things unfold and tell the story. So that took me a little bit of time to get used to, and referencing the rulebook, which did definitely break immersion and felt clunky again for the first few sessions. So this system might take you a little bit of time to get used to, particularly if you're used to more heavy rules, focused systems that's a little bit more crunchy. This is more free-flowing, but having to reference different charts, so it's just a different way of playing and might be a learning curve for you. I also felt like it was easy as a GM to fall into a bad pattern of using the same moves over and over again, so just keep in mind to keep it variety and make sure to print out your different moves so it's easier to reference. The next mechanic I want to hit on is stability. There are 10 different levels, and you can keep playing a character even if they're unstable, which was a cool experience to kind of watch that degradation of their mental state. And there are various ways that stability can go down, such as bad things happening to relations, a hard GM move that calls for it, or failing a keep it together player move. And once they hit broken status, then the GM can make a move. My overall review for the stability part of this is it was pretty easy mechanics, but it didn't lend itself to naturally role-playing since everything was very mechanically based, like a -2 certain rolls or all rolls. It was important that I encouraged my players to play as they were getting more and more unstable and use those descriptions like being anxious or distressed to really play up their stability level. Since it's so mechanically based, I don't think that the rules give a ton of support for how to roleplay that instability, so it's up to the players to lean into that and really get a grasp on how their character is changing throughout the play. Now, combat, like anything else, uses player moves and GM moves. They're just limited to a certain list that you're likely going to use during combat. There aren't specific actions or a chart of who goes when, so this is more free-flowing than I was typically used to and took a little bit of time to get used to as well. PCs can take up to 3 serious wounds and 1 critical wound. And after that, if they filled everything up, then their character will die. But they can also choose to kill off their character earlier than that if they feel like it's appropriate for the given situation. The NPC damage was pretty simple here. Every NPC just had a number of harms that it could take, generally about 3 to 4 harm. And that was a simple way for me as a GM just to check off and quickly assess how long the combat would be based on the number of harms for this specific monster, creature, or other human. Where I ended up landing is I do feel like it's a lot of pressure on the GM. There's a lot more improv, there's a lot more going on in your head to balance these different things to move the story forward, but give them enough information based on their roles. And to that end, I ended up thinking that KULT was a game I preferred to be on the player side for versus the GM side. There are certain games I like to be the GM a lot better than I like to be on the player side, but this one I felt like I was always wanting to be on the player side when I was on the GM side. And when I was on the player side, I had a blast and had so much fun. Now, of course, this is probably just personal preference, and there might be people out there that love to GM KULT, but for me personally, I feel like this is a game that I just love being a player for. So my overall thoughts on KULT Divinity Lost is the lore was absolutely fantastic, intriguing, and made me want to learn more about it. The character creation was phenomenal, and I would sit at the table and make KULT characters all day if I had time. The relation portion is a key element to what I think makes the game really interesting and unique. The system does feel like a heavy lift for the GM in terms of improv and making sure that you are always varying the moves. However, the player side was really smooth, and I would always sign up to play a KULT game. Once I got the hang of KULT, these were some of the best stories that I have experienced in a role-playing game. Again, it really pushes the boundaries on that horror, and it's a unique feel to some of the other systems I've played. So if you're interested to check it out, I have some information in the description below, and that is my review on KULT. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.